how you create a crash. Speculation, Hoover ever missteps in economic policy, banking, Wild West in the banking. Take us through the base ingredients and tell us if anything is different today. What should we be worried about?
The match that lights the fire every time. And I would argue effectively that in 1929, it was margin loans. Now, you said, could it happen again? And where are we today?
Welcome to Open Book. I am your host, Anthony Scaramucci. Joining us now is the world famous and very talented Andrew Ross Sorkin. Title of the book is 1929, The Inside Story of the Greatest Crash in Wall Street History. Andrew, welcome to the show. I love our relationship, and you are very famous for many reasons, but you're also the best-selling author of Too Big to Fail. But what drew you back nearly a century to write the 1929 crash?
I mean, the truth was that I didn't know enough about 1929 crash. I'd written about 2008 and the financial crisis, and people would always ask me to compare the two, and I didn't always have a great answer. And I think most people that I know sort of have only a vague conception that something pretty terrible happened back then that led to the Great Depression. And I always love books, I think like you love books, about people, about, those great books that put you in the room with those people, Barbarians of the Gate, Den of Thieves, all those kind of, inside the room kind of books, fly on the wall kind of things. And I thought, wow, could I try to do that to this?
Listen, I was enthralled by the different characters in the story. I had read Lords of Finance by Liaquat Ahmed
Fabulous
maybe
book.
15 years ago. You referenced it a little bit in here. I read Galbraith's Crash, but that was like when I was in college, so
Yep.
I didn't really have
Also a great book.
lot of memory of that. But let's set the scene, though, because, when I closed your book, I took some notes, and I said, okay, what did I learn from Andrew's book? Greed always overcomes wisdom. I think that's one of the number one things. You had tremendous excesses going on in the late 20s, okay, as it related to margin and the use of margin. And then you had an insider grab bag, which was legal at the time,
Right.
but the insiders were sort of moving things around in a way that the outsiders could never have been able to have taken advantage of, right? So guys like Joe Kennedy got out of there barely unscathed, right?
Pretty much you got it right, with one extra feature, I think, which is set against a backdrop of just wild euphoria. So I think it's the debt piece, meaning just the amount of credit and leverage in the system. That to me is the match that lights the fire. There's always some semblance of euphoria because by default you have to get sort of a speculative frenzy going. And then when you sort of don't have enough transparency in the system, when you have people manipulating and doing all sorts of shenanigans, charlatans and frauds and everything, it gets complicated quick.
All right. The other thing I got out of the book is that these were like patricians. These were waspy people living in the
Yes.
Fifth Avenue salons. They were living in Tuxedo Park. They were summering in Newport and hanging out in Greenwich. I mean, this was not, these were not like old school, like when you think of like the mob and Al Capone back in the 30s. This was a different style of crime, right?
This was a totally different style of crime, and the truth was it really wasn't crime. I mean, because there was no rules. I mean, I think about this all the time. Sometimes I wonder what I would have done back then, or you would have done back then, or any of us would have done back then. And not to excuse the behavior, because I think as you read it, especially in the context of today, you'd say, oh my goodness, this is criminal, this is wrong. At a minimum, this is immoral. But I always have found that one of the things that's so interesting about the markets is it's a business of people who think they're trying to outwit somebody else, right? Whoever's buying a stock thinks they're smarter than the guy they're selling it to. And whoever's selling the stock thinks that they're smarter than the guy who's buying it from them.
All right, so draw an analogy to today. Okay, so you obviously you were influenced by your research on Too Big to Fail. What's interesting, I finished this book about 2 weeks ago, and I read Too Big to Fail about, I don't know, 12 or 13 years ago. So I went back and reread that book as well.
Oh, God
And
bless you.
and it was interesting because you definitely took the elements of that book, the motif, the
Yes.
individual stories. You're in the boardroom. you're talking to the people's spouses, you're talking to the people's friends, and you got a lot of interesting characters in this book, Winston Churchill, et cetera. But I guess the thing that it took me aback about this book is that it wasn't really just a single day event. It was like a slow motion crash leading up to the event. So tell us a little bit about that. Tell us about some of the things that went haywire while the fuse was burning in the
Well, that's
late
the well, that's
1920s.
the thing that I think is oftentimes misunderstood about 1929 and frankly the Great Depression. And I will say it was my own misunderstanding too. One that, it wasn't just that there was one, horrific crash. It really was this sort of slow motion situation. In truth, sometimes people talk about Black Thursday, Black Tuesday, Black Monday. There were a lot of black days. I mean, like a lot of black days. And in fact, the stock market effectively fell, when you really think about the fall, close to 50%, but really between the months of October and middle of November of 1929. So it wasn't just one moment. But then, oddly enough, by the end of 1929, the stock market was actually only down 17%, which I know surprised me. Didn't even make the lists of some of the most important stories of the year. And that's because I think there was a misunderstanding in that moment of actually how many families were just completely wiped out because of the leverage and debt that they had taken on. So it wasn't just that the stock market had gone up 50% and they could hold their stocks at, you know, and the equity value had gone down. It's that they were all getting margin called and having to sell their homes and mortgage their houses and, had lost everything. And then it wasn't even just that the crash itself was somehow going to impact the economy by itself, which it was, but didn't have to be the Great Depression. It was really the first domino of then a series of policy choices. And I try to put you in the room with Hoover as well, and with Andrew Mellon, his Treasury Secretary, and inside the Fed, and then Roosevelt, and you see just the mistake after mistake after mistake that they made that made the whole situation that much worse. Everything from raising taxes to implementing tariffs to the Fed, obviously, trying to hold on to the gold standard. I mean, well, the president was trying to hold on to the gold standard. The Fed, wasn't flushing the system with money the way, frankly, Ben Bernanke did in 2008, which I think was, by the way, one of the lessons that he learned when he did his PhD at Princeton about the Great Depression. So I think you're sort of looking at a story that's not really just about 1929. The story, and I had intended actually when I first began the project, I thought, oh, the book's going to start on February or January 1st, 1929, will end at the end of the year. And I realized really to tell the story, you really had to, the full breadth of it, in fact, goes at least through 1933, and at least the way I've tried to tell it, actually all the way through 1940.
The two big players to me, and you mentioned Benjamin Strong, of course, who passes away. He's the first Fed chair.
Right.
He passes away prior to the crash, and Ahmed in his book and you in your book suggest that he probably would have been a little less tight on the Federal Reserve reins and probably would have created more laxity and more liquidity had he
Right.
not passed. So, right. So there's a little bit of a single man theory here, but let's go to Hoover because, Hoover, basically the way you describe him, I was thinking, geez, we could have had a monkey flipping coins and we at least would have gotten half of the decisions right in a coin toss, but he was going 9 out of 10 for getting decisions wrong. So talk about him, some of the mistakes he was making. And by the way, he was a great guy and a very classy guy, and he made a lot of money, and he was a charitable guy. He did all those things, the food programs for veterans and stuff, but he really got this wrong. He had a terrible blind spot as a presidential leader. What was that?
Well, the biggest blind spot was that he really believed that the stock market was somehow disconnected from the real economy. I mean, that was probably his number one mistake. He also thought somehow that it was, that he had the ability, which he did not, to jawbone his way out of it, which was, this idea that he could sort of tell the public something that actually wasn't really happening and tell them basically go put a smile on your face and that they would have a smile on their face. By the way, this is sort of akin to what was going on, when President Biden was telling people that, there was no inflation in the country, and like they didn't understand what was happening. People felt it. And they felt it in 1930, 1931, 1932. Hoover implements these tariffs, which every economist in America is telling him is a terrible idea, in large part because back in 1928, when he was trying to win the election, he went around telling farmers I'm going to try to protect you. I'll put tariffs in place if you elect me. So he felt that he needed to make good on his pledge. Again, sort of another terrible mistake. He was also being advised by a guy that, frankly, he didn't really like that much, Andrew Mellon. But Andrew Mellon was a true capitalist in the sense that his view was, if you made a lot of money, great. And if you lost a lot of money, great. So I think there's a whole bunch of things going on along the way that just really unraveled things.
Going online without ExpressVPN is like forgetting to mute yourself on a Zoom meeting. Do you really want your coworkers to hear you trash talking them? Because all your traffic flows through their servers. Internet service providers, including mobile network providers, know every single website you visit. It's terrible. And in the US, ISPs are legally allowed to sell that information to advertisers. ExpressVPN reroutes 100% of your traffic through secure encrypted servers, so your ISP can't see your browsing history. There are 3 reasons why you need ExpressVPN. Hide your IP address, which makes it extremely difficult for third parties to track your online activity. Number 2, easy to use. Just fire up the app and click one button to get protected. And 3, works on all devices, phones, laptops, tablets, and more, so you can stay private on the go. Select plans include Identity Defender, a new suite of tools to get your data removed from data brokers, alert you when your data appears on the dark web, and even insure against data theft for up to $1 million. Rated number 1 by tech reviewers like CNET and The Verge. As an avid traveler, ExpressVPN is an indispensable tool for me. I never fly or use public Wi-Fi, whether at an airport or a coffee shop, without it. Secure your online data today by visiting expressvpn.com/openbook. That's expressvpn.com/openbook to find out how you can get up to 4 extra months. expressvpn.com/openbook. I mean, listen, there was a great biography of Mellon, too, maybe about 15 years ago. The hatred that Mellon had for Roosevelt and vice versa was another great element of this story. So Roosevelt comes in and more or less does the opposite of Hoover, right? So take us through some of the steps
Well,
that.
so that's actually, I mean, by the way, I'm so curious how you think about it, given how much you know about presidential transitions and the like. One of the things that could have prevented some of the bank failures, and by the way, we ultimately had something like 9,000 bank failures in America, was that Hoover really did understand by 1932. Now, 32, 33, he was late to the party, that he needed to try to bail out the banks. He needed to try to declare a bank holiday or do something relatively drastic to try to save the banking system. But he was so, what's the word? He almost refused to do it.
He was doctrinaire. He was a very doctrinaire guy. He had, he was the opposite of George W. Bush because in Too Big to Fail, you have this great scene where Bush is talking to Paulson and Bush is like, well, I'm a conservative. I don't want to do that. And Paulson's like, okay, well, the whole system's going to blow up.
Right.
So then Bush says, okay, then we're going to do that. That's a left-leaning strategy to dump $1 trillion into the banks. But it felt like Hoover was, he missed the beat there with that, right?
I think he was both
doctrinaire,
doctrinaire, but also embarrassed, to be honest with you, because to some degree, because he had told people for so long that there was no problem, I think it was hard to go back on that. I think that's one of the reasons he was so desperate. At this point, he's now lost the election, knows they need to do something about the banking system, and he goes to Roosevelt secretly and begs him and says, look, I'm going to go do this. I want to do something, but I want you to approve of it. I need you to endorse it. Otherwise, the public is not going to buy into it. And of course, Roosevelt basically just lies to his face and says, well, I'm not doing that, and I'm never going to do that, basically. And of course, Roosevelt's saying that to Hoover because the truth is that he does want to do all those things, but he needs a clean slate. He doesn't want to be attached to this, Hoover doing it first. But as a result, they lost actually some serious time and, frankly, hundreds of banks probably as a result of it.
Yeah, which caused a further contraction, right?
Right.
And the other thing, you were great on the concepts of deflation in this book. I mean, the deflation in the economy, we always talk about inflation, Andrew, but deflation destroys debt-laden economies because you just can't pay back the debt, and you watch these people get back their farm equipment or turn back the keys to their capital equipment, their houses. I mean, it was just absolutely devastating. But, you mentioned presidential transitions. they're very similar. Egomaniacs are fighting with each other, and they don't want each other to get any credit for anything. And it was exemplified there. I guess the story between Wall Street and Washington, like when I read your two books side to side, I'm like, wow, I mean, that clash has been going on for 100 years, and it's the same story.
It's the same story.
Wall Streeters feel like the Washington people know nothing. The Washington people feel like the Wall Street people are just greedy pigs feeding at the trough. Both feel slighted by each other, right? Take us into some of that intrigue.
Well, look, I knew that I could write this story, or thought I had an opportunity to write this story, when I began to fully form and appreciate the story between two, I think, very unique individuals in the context of Charlie Mitchell, who was the CEO of National City, which goes on to become Citigroup. He was running what was the biggest bank in the country. He was sort of he was as famous as Jamie Dimon, but probably less conservative than Jamie Dimon in terms of how he thinks about the market. Call him Sunshine Charlie. He used to always say that we thought we should sell stocks the way we sell neckties. So he wanted to sort of demystify finance. And he was largely responsible for really almost creating the credit market so that people could buy stock on margin. And people were doing this, 10 to 1. You put up a buck, they'd give you 10, they'd loan you $10 because of Sunshine Charlie. And on the other side of the story, and this is where I really thought, okay, could be the spine of the story, the clash of these egos, is a guy named Carter Glass, Senator of Virginia. I think a lot of your audience will know him better because his name is attached to the bill that ultimately breaks up the banks in 1933. But Carter Glass was the Elizabeth Warren of his time, and he was railing for years about this thing called Mitchellism. I mean, he used to call it Mitchellism, how he believed Charlie Mitchell and Wall Street were going to just ruin the economy, that speculation gotten out of control. He was trying to come up with every, possible way to, damp down some of the speculation. At one point, he was proposing ideas to, put taxes on, stock trading to end speculation, for example. And interestingly, he did have a sense. He was a smart guy. He understood the economy and finance pretty well. He was largely responsible, actually, for the creation of the Federal Reserve and the bill that actually put that in place back in 1913. And so you could sort of see the Washington Wall Street fight through the prism of those two individuals.
So, Andrew, I love that story about Mitchell, by the way. I followed it right to the end and, his eventual exoneration at trial, but also just the things that he went through and the reputation damaging. And the way you wrote about Lamont and JP Morgan's son, it was classic, right? The one guy's working, the other guy's like a dilettante, doesn't want to get his hands dirty, right? I mean, it's just everything that you and I have experienced in life. But I want to talk in a Dr. Frankenstein sort of a way, okay?
Okay.
In terms of like how you create life, Mary Shelley, Dr. Frankenstein. But I want Andrew Sorkin to channel how you create a crash. Speculation, Hoover ever missteps in economic policy, the banking, Wild West in the banking, fractional banking system with the Wild West, and the people don't even understand if they put their money in the bank, they could lose it if the bank has credit missteps. Take us through the base ingredients and tell us if anything is different today. And if it isn't different, what should we be worried about?
Okay, so look, the match that lights the fire every time you saw it you read Too Big to Fail or you reread Too Big to Fail. The match that lit that fire was too much leverage in the system in the context of subprime loans.
Leverage and confidence, right? Because you had
Leverage and
these
confidence.
subprime loans that were AAA rated.
Yep.
People are like, well, I'm going to get the money back. I'm going to just keep leveraging them, right? The CDO market, all that
Exactly.
stuff.
And I would argue effectively that in 1928, in 1929, it was margin loans. It largely was margin loans. Now, you said, could it happen again? And where are we today? The good news in my mind is, look, there was no SEC back then. Even if you think the SEC is not doing a lot right now, it still exists. There are people who are hopefully monitoring some of this. So some of the shenanigans, I like to think, aren't as significant as they were then. By the way, there was no bank capital requirements back then. There was no rules. There was no insider trading rules. There was no nothing. So I like to believe that, yeah, we can have corrections. We can even have crashes, but they don't have to turn into depressions. So could you have a crash like 1999? Sure. Could you have a crash even like 2008? Sure. But in both instances, we did come back a lot quicker than obviously what took place in 1929 and then ultimately 30, 31, 32. And I think part of the answer is we've also learned that in those moments, you do flood the system with money. Now, one difference that is very different today than even 10 or 15 years ago or 1999 or before, which I haven't really, I don't know the full extent of just what the implication would be, which is U.S. debt is so large that it might make it more and more complicated to throw money at the problem. So here we are back in 1929. There was a budget surplus, by the way, back then. We hardly had any debt. But I think the biggest thing is leverage. And the biggest thing is where's the leverage and knowing about it and having transparency around it. And I do have some worries today about those issues. So we have the euphoria and the AI bubble that's clearly taking place. There's indiscriminate spending. I think everyone would agree with that. Then the question is, where's the leverage? And is there too much leverage in the system? And I think partially because of private credit today, which is to say that so much of it is in the shadows, I don't think we know right this moment. I don't know. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm worried about it. I mean, one of the analogies that you brought up that had me worried was what the Federal Reserve was doing in 29. They were tightening credit after the bubble had already formed. Jerome Powell is sort of, he's taking balance sheet back, right? He's shrinking the balance sheet at a time where you've got an explosion in corporate debt. I mean, it's a record
Right.
corporate debt, and it's direct corporate debt, so it may not hurt the banking industry, but it'll collapse the credit markets, which will seize the economy, right? I mean, so I'm worried about that. Also, the thing you also brought up, which I want to reference, is the inequality. So I think the numbers you used in 1929, it was like 25% of the 1% controlled 25% of the
Yes.
country's wealth. But today, Andrew, doing the calculation, it's a little bit over 30%. And so I'm wondering if that extreme inequality, okay, is hurting the country. Like, for sure, as an economist, the extreme inequality actually hurts innovation because what happens is the rich just sit on everything,
Right.
and then they pay the government not to break them up, right? So, they sit there, they lobby the government, don't break up my Mag 7 company.
Right.
And even though the irony is breaking up AT&T enabled us to create the Mag 7, they don't want to get any any breakup, right? So when you get wealth concentration, you weirdly get a lack of innovation.
So I think not only are you right about that, there's one other feature of it, which is that once you get into a serious inequality situation, people start to be desperate and start to ordinary individuals who are suffering from the inequality part of this take risks that they otherwise would not, right? A lot of what was happening was people really wanted access to the lottery ticket. They
Right.
wanted to buy the
Yeah,
lottery
exactly.
ticket. And, the truth is that when most people buy a lottery ticket, most people lose. And I think that's actually, you know, a big feature of why people were making some of the bets that they were making in the late 20s. They saw people making money. They wanted in on it. You know, I'm curious where you land on this. I think there's a lot of people who've actually, and by the way, they've benefited from this. They've looked at Bitcoin and crypto as a lottery ticket for themselves. And actually, so far, on the whole, if they did it early, it's paid off in a very, very big way. But there's also a lot of leverage in some of those trades. Look at some of those interesting option markets around Bitcoin and Ethereum and some of these others with it. You could do it for 20 times, 50 times. I mean, I don't know how much of a big piece of the market that is in crypto, but obviously crypto was something that didn't exist in 1929.
Well, listen, this is me interviewing you, but I will interject here a little bit and tell you that that was the first thing I thought of when I closed the book. Where is the Wild West right now? The Wild West was the stock market in 1929. The Wild West right now is the unregulated crypto market and the unregulated global crypto market. Now, the good news is it's only about $4 trillion. So if the whole thing implodes, it'll be painful, but it won't destroy the whole system. But I'm going to say something in praise of Gary Gensler. Okay, you ready? Just, buckle up,
Okay.
buckle
Oh
up.
my
Okay,
goodness.
right,
Get
in
my
praise
get
of
my
Gary Gensler. Okay,
okay.
get your seatbelt on. So weirdly, by being politically motivated and blocking the cash or the spot Bitcoin ETF, like when I took administrative law, and I've come on your show, the futures ETF is approved in November of 21. You would look at administrative law statute and say, okay, though the cash one will be approved within 6 months because it's the goal is not to be arbitrary or capricious. But Gensler shuts it down. Okay, he's very politically motivated. He loses the court case as evidence of how politically motivated it is. But weirdly, he sets in motion the car crash of Three Arrows, Sam Bankman-Fried,
Right.
those blockchain lending companies
Right.
all imploded. And he took so much leverage out of the system that when it was time to get the ETF approved, like when BlackRock got its ETF approved, he had strained all the excess out of the system. Now that excess is building again. So I'm worried about it. You're worried about it. I think smart people should be. But weirdly, we could still be living in a world of Sam Bankman-Fried because maybe that floating of the ETF would have masked over some of the nefarious things that he was doing, right?
Right.
So,
That's
I mean,
interesting. That's
it's
interesting.
just, look, my colleagues in the industry probably get pissed at me for making that comment, but I think he weirdly helped the industry survive because there was a lot of nefarious things, a lot of 1929 things going
Right.
on in the industry due to the lack of regulation. So, all right, well, we're down to the last 5 minutes. So what I do with my producers, Andrew, is I come up with 5 words
Okay.
or 5 thoughts. We cull
Okay.
them from your book. Okay, so you have to. It's almost like a Rorschach test. I'm going to say the thing and then you respond. Okay, you
Okay.
ready?
Here we go.
All right. I say the word crash. You say what?
Pain.
Okay. I say the words, 2 words, Wall Street.
Complicated.
Complicated. All right. Give me another. Just give me one more sentence. Go ahead.
Matching of wits. Matching of wits.
See, when I hear the word Wall Street, I think of good and bad.
Well,
There's the
that that's what I'm calling
arterial,
complicated.
right? Arterial structure, flow of capitalism creates innovation, but then there's a lot of riffraff in Wall Street, as we both know, right?
But that's the thing about all of this, which is, you read a book like this and work on a book like this for all this time, and you start to think, okay, you're going to become like a Cassandra. But the truth is that it's been much more profitable to be a professional optimist than a professional skeptic over the last 100 years.
No question. All right. All right. So we did Wall Street. Let's keep going. And number 3, let's say the word Washington. And I don't mean George. I
I
mean
know.
DC.
Mistakes.
Yeah.
That's my word. Mistakes.
So you see, everyone calls Washington a swamp. I see it as a gold-plated hot tub. I think these guys sit in the hot tub and they pass the Cubanos and the Cristal and they hang out together. And if you're with them, you sit and bubble up in the hot tub. If you're not with them, they throw you out of there. It's just, it's a
I don't know. Maybe they've installed a hot tub in the White House. I don't even think it's that fancy, though.
it's an ugly place. Let's just put it that way. Okay. I
You
got
spent
my
more time there than I have.
I got my 11-day PhD on how bad it works. It's ugly. All right. I say 2008. You say what?
You say 2008, and I say sequel, as in sequel to 1929.
Yeah. I say a rhyme. A
A
rhyme.
rhyme.
Right. History
History
doesn't
rhymes.
necessarily exactly repeat itself, but it was rhyming with 1929, right?
100%.
Okay, so I hear the word a rhyme. Here's 1929. And we'll end with that. I say the words 1929, and I'll give you the last word. What do you say?
Hold on. You say 1929. What do you think?
I say 1929. I want to hear what you think first.
The greatest lesson.
See, I got to tell you something that I really think about your book, okay? You wrote a book about the downfall of the economy and the crash. But when I closed the book, I thought, okay, this was the day that America grew up. This is the day where America said, okay, we're going to get a leader in to put a welfare system in and to provide a safety net for the indigent. This is the day that America is going to start to institutionalize government,
Yep.
which, believe it or not, led to the institutionalization and mechanisms that allowed us to win the war, which set up 80 years of tremendous prosperity for the West. So it's a weird thing, but it was a very bad thing that happened, Andrew.
But it was
But
a great
it's
lesson.
and it set us up,
It set us
okay,
up.
for what
That's what I
Henry
meant.
Luce once said was the American century. So
Yep.
anyway, I congratulate you on having a best-selling book. You know, my books are bestsellers, Andrew, but they're all stacked up here in my basement. I mean, that's the problem with my books, but not yours, Andrew. This one got
Thank
to the
you.
bestseller list in the first week.
Thank
The
you.
title of the book is 1929 Inside the Greatest Crash in Wall Street History. Now, it shattered the nation, but also possibly birthed the nation. And so,
I like that. I like the optimism.
yeah, I think it did. I really do. I think
think
it
it
had a
did. I agree.
big impact. You know, I mean, I think Roosevelt looked around and said, you know, as Rahm Emanuel once said, and you quote him in 2000, let's not waste the crisis. Okay. The crisis would be a wasted opportunity. And Roosevelt looked at this and said, okay, we got to protect the indigent. And even though some thought he was a traitor to his class, in many ways, he saved his class. He saved his class from a nationalist fervor, an America First movement in the late 30s. He saved us from all different types of things. And it started in 1929.
There you go.
All right. Well, anyway, thank you for joining us,
Thank
man.
you.
Well,
Thank you, sir.
congratulations again, brother.